Most people don't think about elevators until one stops working, and even then they think about them for about 30 seconds, long enough to push the button again, maybe twice, and then they forget about them completely. I've been an elevator mechanic for 26 years. I want to start by telling you that, because I think people hear the word mechanic and picture someone with a wrench leaning against a wall, and that's not what the job is. A modern elevator is a precision machine governed by a control system, and an old elevator, the kind I specialize in, the kind found in buildings that are 70, 80, 90 years old, is something closer to a piece of working history. Relay logic, mechanical governors, hoistway equipment that was installed by men who are long dead, using techniques that aren't taught anymore because nobody builds elevators that weigh anymore. I work for myself now, but for most of my career, I worked for a company that specialized in historic buildings, hotels mostly, and a few office buildings and apartment buildings old enough to have elevators that predate modern code. If a hotel from 1920 needed its elevator serviced, recertified, or modernized without losing its character, there was a decent chance I'd get the call. I've been inside elevator shafts in some of the oldest standing buildings in this part of the country. I've seen things in those shafts, old equipment, old graffiti, things people dropped down there decades ago and never retrieved, that most people will never see, because most people never think about what's behind the doors. I'm telling you all of this because what I'm about to describe happened in a hoistway, and I want you to understand that I know hoistways. I've spent more hours of my life in elevator shafts than most people spend in their own basements. I am not someone who gets uneasy in tight, dark, mechanical spaces. That's the whole job. The hotel was built in 1926. 12 stories, brick and limestone, the kind of mid-sized commercial hotel that used to be common in small cities, built for traveling salesmen and businessmen, with a lobby that was grander than the rooms, which were small and practical. By the time I got the call, the hotel had been through several identities. A residential hotel in the 60s and 70s, vacant for a stretch in the 80s, and now it was being converted into what the developers called a boutique property, which in practice meant gutting most of the interior while preserving the parts that photographed well: the lobby, the facade, and the elevator. The elevator was original. 1926 Otis, electric traction, manually operated when it was installed, meaning it originally had an operator who ran it before it was converted to automatic push-button operation sometime in the 1950s. The developers wanted it recertified and modernized just enough to meet current code while keeping the original cab, which was beautiful. Brass details, a folding gate instead of a solid door, wood paneling that had been refinished but was original to the install. My job was 3 weeks of work: full inspection, governor recertification, control system modernization, while preserving the cab and the original hoistway equipment as much as possible. I started in October. The hotel had 12 floors. The elevator served all 12. On the second day, I was in the machine room on the roof, going through the original equipment tags. Every piece of elevator equipment has a data plate, and on equipment this old, the data plates are sometimes the only documentation that survives. I was cataloging everything before I started any work, which is standard practice on a historic job. You document the existing condition thoroughly, because once you start modernizing, you can't always put things back the way they were. The governor, the safety device that controls the cab's speed and triggers the emergency brake if the cab moves too fast, had its original data plate. 1926, Otis Elevator Company, and a service tag that listed the floors the car served. It listed 13 floors. I looked at the tag for a while. Then I went down to the lobby and looked at the elevator's call panel, which was original. Brass buttons in a vertical row, etched with floor numbers. I counted them. 12 buttons. 1 through 12. No 13. This isn't unusual, by the way. I want to say that clearly, because I know where this story sounds like it's going. A huge number of buildings from this era skip the number 13 for superstition reasons. It's extremely common. The building's 12th floor is often, structurally, the 13th floor. The floors are all there. They're just renumbered so that nobody has to stay on the 13th floor. I've seen it dozens of times. My assumption, looking at that governor tag, was that it was just listing the actual floor count, 13 floors of the building, including whatever the top floor was called, regardless of what the button said. I made a note in my file. Governor tag references 13 floors. Building has 12 labeled floors, likely superstition renumbering, verify against original blueprints, and went back to work. The original blueprints were in the building's archive, which the developer had inherited along with the property. I requested them through the site supervisor and was told it would take a few days to locate them in storage. In the meantime, I kept working. On the 4th day, I rode the elevator to the top of the hoistway to inspect the overhead sheaves, the pulleys at the top of the shaft that the hoist cables run over. To do this safely, you put the car near the top floor, then climb out through the top of the cab onto a small working platform above it, called the car top, and ride the car up slowly from there using a separate control. I got on the car top at the 12th floor and started the car moving upwards slowly, the way you do for this kind of inspection, a few feet at a time, checking clearances. The car top stopped about 4 feet below the overhead sheaves, which was normal. That's the top of the travel for a 12-story building with this hoistway configuration. But above the sheaves, in the very top of the shaft, what's called the overhead clearance, the empty space above the highest point the car ever travels, there was more shaft than there should have been. I want to explain why this mattered to me. Overhead clearance in a hoistway is calculated precisely. It's the minimum safe distance required above the car's highest travel point for the equipment and for safety in the event of over-travel. It's usually a specific number of feet, code mandated, and it doesn't vary much. I've worked on enough of these shafts to have a feel for what that distance should look like. This shaft had roughly double the overhead clearance I would have expected. I climbed back into the cab, brought the car down, and went to the roof. I walked the perimeter of the building's roofline, looking at where the elevator penthouse, the machine room structure on the roof, sat relative to the rest of the roof. The penthouse was set back from the edge, and it was taller than I would have expected for a building this size. Looking at it from the roof, it looked almost like it had room inside it for an additional floor, not living space, just height. Dead space. I went back down to the lobby and found the site supervisor and asked him, as casually as I could, whether the building had ever had 13 floors. He said, "Not that I know of. Why?" I said it was nothing, just doing my due diligence. He told me the blueprints had turned up and were in the construction trailer. The original 1926 blueprints showed 13 floors. Floor 13 was small, not a full floor in the way the others were. It looked like it had been a mechanical and storage level, maybe 6 feet of usable headroom in places, tucked into the space between the 12th floor ceiling and the roof. The blueprints labeled it floor 13 without any apparent hesitation about the number, which told me something. Whatever renaming had happened after these blueprints were drawn. I found a second set of drawings, dated 1927, 1 year later. In this set, floor 13 had been removed from the elevator service. The blueprint showed the same physical space. It still existed structurally, but the elevator shaft no longer had a door opening onto it. The call buttons had been reduced from 13 to 12, and floor 13 itself had been relabeled in small text as floor 12M. Mezzanine. There was no explanation. in the drawings for the change. Architectural drawings don't usually include explanations. They show what's there, not why. But a change like that, 1 year after a building opens, sealing off an elevator stop and relabeling a floor, is not a superstition renumbering. Superstition renumbering happens at the design stage, before anything is built. This was a modification to a completed building. I went back to the site supervisor with the drawings and asked if there was any documentation about why the change had been made. He didn't know, but he said something that I didn't expect. There's an old maintenance log in the archive too. Goes back decades. You want it? I said yes. The maintenance logs for the elevator went back to 1928, 2 years after the building opened, 1 year after floor 13 had been sealed off. They were kept by the building's engineers over the decades, a continuous record of elevator service, repairs, and inspections. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect: routine maintenance, cable replacements, door adjustments. But scattered through the decades, not every year, not on any pattern I could immediately identify, there were entries that weren't routine. The earliest one I found was from 1931. It said, "Car stopped between 12 and roof, no call registered. Reset governor, resumed service. Engineer noted unusual sound from shaft above car. Investigated, found nothing." Over the next several days, while continuing my actual job, the governor recertification was a real task with a real deadline, and I couldn't spend all my time reading old logs. I went through as much history as I could. The pattern, once I started looking for it, was there. Roughly every few years, sometimes longer gaps, sometimes shorter, an entry that described the same basic event. The car stopping between the 12th floor and the machine room, with no call registered, meaning no button had been pressed for that position, because there was no button for that position, and an engineer investigating and finding nothing. 1931, 1938, 1944, 1952, 1959, 1967. Roughly 7 or 8 years apart, with some variation. Always the same description: car stops above 12, no call registered, nothing found. The 1959 entry was longer than the others. The engineer who wrote it, his initials were R.D.V., had clearly been bothered by the event in a way the other entries didn't suggest. He wrote, "Car stopped above 12 at approx 0240. No call registered, car was unoccupied overnight, no service requests logged. Investigated personally. Car was stopped level, with sealed door of former floor 13. Door is plastered over from corridor side, but elevator side panel still visible behind cab wall. Heard what I would describe as footsteps on the other side of the panel, slow, several of them, stopping when I knocked. Reset car, resumed normal operation. Will monitor." There was a follow-up entry 2 days later in the same handwriting, no recurrence. Spoke to night staff. 2 of them report hearing the car move on its own, late at night, over the years, always stopping in the same place. Building has apparently always been noisy in this regard. Nobody seems concerned. Filing this for the record, in case future engineers want context. I sat in the construction trailer with that log for a long time. I want to be honest about what I did next, because I think it's the part of this story that matters most, and I want you to understand the reasoning, even if you don't agree with the decision. I had access to the elevator. I had the original blueprints, which showed exactly where the sealed door to floor 13 was on the north side of the shaft, accessible from the car top, behind a panel that the 1959 engineer had described as still visible behind cab wall. I had 3 weeks on this job, and I was, by day 9, slightly ahead of schedule. I decided I wanted to see the panel. I positioned the car at the 12th floor, climbed onto the car top, and brought the car up slowly until I reached the position described in the maintenance logs, stopped above 12, level with the sealed door. The panel was there. Plywood, painted to match the shaft wall, clearly added at some point after the original construction. The paint was a different era than the surrounding brick, newer but still old, probably from whenever the door had been sealed on this side. It was about the size of a standard door, set into what had once been a doorway opening directly onto the elevator shaft from floor 13. I want to tell you what the shaft felt like at that moment, because I think the feeling is important, even though I can't fully explain it. 26 years in hoistways, and hoistways have a consistent quality to them. They're mechanical spaces. They smell like grease and old brick and cool air moving through a vertical shaft, and that quality doesn't usually vary much from building to building. This part of the shaft felt different. Not colder exactly, though it was colder slightly. It felt like a room that had been closed for a long time and had just been opened. The specific staleness of air that hasn't moved. I knocked on the panel 3 times, the way you'd knock on a door. From the other side, after a pause, 3 knocks came back. I sat on that car top for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably only a few minutes. I knocked again, a different pattern this time, 2 quick knocks and a pause and 1 more. The response came back, 2 quick knocks, a pause, 1 more. The same pattern, exactly. I said out loud into the shaft, "Can you hear me?" Nothing. No knock, no sound. I said it again, and then I said, "I'm not going to open this. I just want to know if someone's there." A pause. Then, from behind the panel, 3 knocks again. The same 3 knocks as the first time. I brought the car down to the 12th floor, climbed back inside, and sat in the cab for a while with the gate closed, just thinking. Here is what I knew. A floor had existed, briefly, in 1926 and part of 1927. It had been sealed off from the elevator within a year of the building opening, for reasons no surviving document explained. For nearly a century afterward, at irregular intervals averaging roughly 7 to 8 years, the elevator car had stopped at that sealed floor with no call registered, meaning something on the other side of that wall was calling it. And whatever was on the other side of that wall could hear me, and could respond to a knocking pattern with enough precision to mirror it exactly, but either couldn't or wouldn't respond to a direct question. I thought about R.D.V., the engineer from 1959, writing his note for the record in case future engineers wanted context. I thought about how many engineers over 98 years must have stood approximately where I was standing and made some version of the decision I was making now, to note it and not push further and move on. I decided I wasn't going to be the engineer who pushed further. Not because I was afraid, though I was a little by then. Because it occurred to me that whatever was behind that panel had been there for a very long time, responding to knocks with the same exact pattern every time someone knocked, and never once, in 98 years, had it done anything except knock back. That's not a threat. That's a routine. I finished the job. Governor recertified, control system modernized, original cab preserved exactly as the developer wanted. The elevator passed inspection in early November and went back into service for the hotel's soft opening. Before I left the site for the last time, I did 2 things. First, I went back to the maintenance log, which the developer was keeping, digitized now, as part of the building's permanent records, and I added an entry of my own. I described what I'd found, the original blueprints, the ceiling of floor 13 in 1927, the pattern of unexplained car stops going back to 1931, and what I'd done on day 9. I wrote it factually, the way R.D.V. had written his note in 1959. At the end, I wrote, Recommend future engineers be made aware of this history before performing car-top work above the 12th floor. The occupant of the sealed space appears passive and has, as far as the record shows, never caused any malfunction or safety issue. No corrective action is recommended or, in my opinion, advisable. Second, and I debated this for a long time before doing it, I went back up one more time. Car top, position above 12, level with the panel. I knocked the same 3 knocks I'd knocked the first time. The response came back immediately. 3 knocks. I said, I'm finishing up today. The elevator's going to be running a lot more now. The hotel's opening. You'll probably hear it more often. I paused, feeling, as I had the first time, slightly ridiculous, and continued anyway. I wrote down what I found. About the floor. About 1927. So if anyone in the future wonders what's up here, they'll know not to be alarmed. They'll know to just knock back, I guess, if they want to. A pause, longer than the others. Then from behind the panel, not 3 knocks, 4. Evenly spaced, unhurried. It was a different pattern than anything I'd knocked. The first time, in 98 years of recorded incidents, that whatever was up that had initiated something instead of mirroring it. I sat with that for a moment. Then I knocked back, 4 knocks, the same spacing. Nothing came after that. Just silence, not an absent silence, but the kind of silence that follows a conversation that's reached a natural pause. I brought the car down, climbed inside, and rode it to the lobby. The hotel has been open for a little over a year now. I drive past it sometimes. It's not far from where I live, and I have a strange proprietary feeling about elevators I've worked on, the way I imagine doctors feel about patients they've treated. I'll probably feel that way about this building for the rest of my career. I called the site supervisor about 6 months after the opening on a pretext, following up about a minor adjustment I'd made, which is a normal thing to do. I asked near the end of the call whether anything unusual had come up with the elevator. He said no, it had been running great. Then he laughed and said, "Funny thing, though, housekeeping on 12 says sometimes they hear it stop for a second between floors late at night when nobody's called it." I told them it's a 100-year-old machine. It's allowed to have its quirks. I asked how often. He said he didn't know, not often. Maybe once a year. Why, is that something I should worry about? I told him no. I told him it was normal for a building this old, and that it was in the maintenance log if anyone ever wanted the history, and that there was nothing that needed fixing. All of that was true. What I didn't tell him, because I didn't have a way to say it that wouldn't sound strange, and because I'm not sure it needed saying, was that I hoped it kept happening. Once a year, or every 7 years, or however often it turned out to be. I hoped that whatever had spent 98 years in a sealed 6-foot space between the 12th floor and the roof, responding to knocks with patient, exact precision, was still doing what it had always done. And I hoped that someday, the housekeeping staff on the 12th floor, hearing the elevator pause for no reason in the small hours of the morning, might knock on the wall. Just to see. And that something on the other side might knock back. 4 times. Evenly spaced. Unhurried. Like someone saying, "Still here. Thanks for asking." The map was wrong. That was the first thing I noticed, and I want to be clear that I noticed it immediately, not in retrospect, not after everything else happened. The moment I unfolded it, I knew something was off. I'm a surveyor. I've been doing land surveys and property boundary work for 11 years. Before that, I spent 4 years in the Army Corps of Engineers doing topographic mapping in places where the terrain was actively hostile to the people trying to measure it. I understand maps the way a musician understands sheet music, not as a representation of a thing, but as the thing itself. A map is a precise language. When that language is wrong, you know. The map I'm describing was a hand-drawn floor plan of a residential property I'd been hired to survey in Dunmore County. A rural property, substantial acreage, older house. The client was an estate lawyer, handling the sale of a deceased woman's home and land. Standard work. The estate had provided a hand-drawn map of the house interior, made by the previous owner herself, which the lawyer said she'd kept in a folder of property documents. He thought it might be useful for my survey work. I thanked him and took it and unfolded it at my kitchen table that evening. The map showed the interior of the house: ground floor, second floor, partial basement. It was careful and detailed in the way that people who are naturally precise draw things. The rooms were labeled, the dimensions were annotated, the doors and windows were marked. The woman had been thorough. She had clearly known the house very well. But at the back of the ground floor, past what was labeled as a utility room, there was a door. The door led to a room that was not labeled. It had dimensions, 14 by 18 feet, and two features marked inside it: a circle near the center of the room, annotated with a single lowercase letter, and a straight line along the far wall, annotated with nothing at all. The lowercase letter was W. I looked at the house plans. The estate lawyer had also provided official county records, drawn up when the house was built in 1962. According to those plans, the utility room was the end of the structure. There was no door. There was no 14 by 18 room behind it. I put both documents side by side and studied them for a long time. The hand-drawn map was not a mistake. It was too careful for mistakes. The woman who drew it had measured her house and recorded what she found, with the patient attention of someone who needed an accurate record for reasons I didn't yet understand. She had drawn a room that shouldn't exist. I drove out to the property the following morning. The house was a two-story farmhouse set well back from a county road, accessible by a long gravel drive flanked by old-growth oak. It had been empty for 4 months. The woman had died in March. The estate had been in probate since, and no one had been on the property regularly since her death. The estate lawyer had given me a key and the security code for an alarm system that he said may or may not still be active. It was a Wednesday morning in July, already warm, the kind of flat summer light that makes old houses look both beautiful and melancholy. I parked, got my equipment bag, and stood for a moment looking at the house. It was well maintained. That was my first impression. Not the neglected shell you sometimes find with rural estates that have been sitting vacant. The paint was recent, the gutters were clear, the yard had been kept. Whoever had lived here had cared about the place. I let myself in through the front door. The alarm panel by the door showed a steady green light, either disarmed or defunct. It didn't matter. I stood in the entry hall and let my eyes adjust. The interior matched the hand-drawn map precisely. I'd studied it enough that I could navigate without looking at it. Entry hall, living room left, dining room right, kitchen straight back, utility room off the kitchen. I moved through each room slowly, doing what surveyors do, noting dimensions, checking the relationship of walls to the official floor plan, looking for anomalies. The house was exactly what the 1962 plans said it was, until I reached the utility room. The utility room was at the back of the house, off the kitchen, a standard laundry and storage space, washer and dryer hookups along one wall, shelving along another, bare concrete floor. Everything exactly as expected, except the far wall. The far wall of the utility room should have been an exterior wall. The 1962 plans were unambiguous. This was the back of the house, and beyond this wall was the yard. Standard frame construction, insulation, siding. But the wall had a door in it. Not a recent addition. The door frame was integrated into the wall construction, painted the same color as the surrounding surface, with the same faint yellowing of old paint. This door had always been here. Whoever had drawn the 1962 plans had simply not included it. The door had no lock. Just a standard interior knob, the kind you find on closets and utility rooms. I stood in front of it for a moment with my hand on the knob and thought about the hand-drawn map and the 14 by 18 room and the lowercase w and the line along the far wall. Then I opened it. The room was exactly the dimensions on the map. 14 feet wide, 18 feet deep, with a low ceiling lower than the rest of the house, maybe 7 feet. The floor was concrete, like the utility room. The walls were unfinished drywall, never painted, which gave the space the stark quality of a room that was built for function and never made comfortable. There were no windows. The only light came from a single bulb on the ceiling, which I tested and which still worked. A bare, cold light that made the room feel clinical. In the center of the room, where the circle had been marked on the map, there was a well. Not a decorative feature. Not a planter or a drain. A stone-lined well, maybe 3 feet in diameter, with a wooden cover sitting on top of it. The stones were old, older than the house by the look of them, fieldstone construction of the kind you find in buildings from the 19th century. The well predated the house. Someone had built the house around it, incorporated it into the structure, and then built a room to contain it and a door to reach it, and had not mentioned any of this on the official floor plan. I stood at the edge of the well and looked at the wooden cover. It was heavy, solid, fitted to the opening with the precision of something made by someone who wanted it to stay closed. I looked at the far wall, where the hand-drawn map had shown a straight line with no annotation. There was a shelf, floor to ceiling, built into the wall, the same unfinished wood as the cover on the well. And on the shelf, notebooks. Dozens of them, all the same size, composition notebooks with black and white marbled covers, arranged in order from left to right. The first one on the left had a date written on the spine in black marker, 1974. The last one on the right, 2023. 49 years of notebooks. One per year, from 1974 until the year before the woman died. I picked up the most recent one and opened it. The handwriting was small and careful. The same hand that had drawn the map. I could tell from the particular way she formed her numbers, the same precision in both. The entries were dated, one per week, every Sunday. Each entry was between 1 and 3 pages. I read the first entry in the 2023 notebook, standing in that room under the bare bulb with the well cover 3 feet away from me. The entry described a Sunday in January. The woman, I would learn her name later. For now, she was just the handwriting, had come to the room as she did every Sunday. She had sat beside the well. She had listened. That was the word she used, listened. She wrote, "It was quiet this week. I sat for 40 minutes and heard nothing. I think it is sleeping. I have learned that the winter months are slower. I record this as I always do, in case the record matters to whoever comes after." I stood very still for a moment. Then I read the entry from the previous Sunday. Same structure. She had come to the room, sat beside the well, listened. That week there had been sound. She described it as a low resonance, not quite a tone, felt more than heard, lasting approximately 3 minutes before fading. She had noted the duration, the approximate frequency, and her subjective impression, attentive, as if something was aware of her presence. I put the 2023 notebook back and took down the one from 1974. The first entry was in June of that year. She wrote, "I have discovered the room and the well. The previous owner, Mr. Aldrich, from whom I purchased the property, said nothing about either when we signed the papers. I found the door by accident while moving the washer. I do not know what to make of the well. I lowered a light on a rope and could not see the bottom. I heard something. I am not ready to describe what I heard. I am writing this down because I believe in keeping records of things that cannot be explained." I put the 1974 notebook back. I looked at the well cover. I am a surveyor. My job is to measure and record and document. My job is to produce an accurate account of what exists. I reached down and lifted the cover. The well was deep. I had a flashlight in my bag, and I shone it straight down and could not find the bottom. The beam dissolved into darkness maybe 40 feet down without hitting anything. The stone walls were smooth and damp. The air that came up from the opening was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the July morning above it, deep earth cold, the temperature of places that have never seen sunlight. I listened. For maybe 30 seconds, there was nothing. Then I heard what I can only describe as pressure. Not a sound exactly, not a tone or a voice or a mechanical noise. A change in the quality of the silence. The particular sensation of a space becoming occupied. The way a room feels different when someone walks into it even before you turn around to see them. Then from the depth of the well, a sound, low, resonant. Not quite a tone, the way the 2023 notebook had described it. Felt more than heard, the way very low frequencies are felt rather than processed through the ear. It lasted approximately 4 seconds and then stopped. I stood at the opening of the well with my flashlight pointed down into the darkness, and I breathed slowly and waited. The sound came again. Slightly longer this time. 7, maybe 8 seconds. And in it, or beneath it, or alongside it in a register I couldn't quite resolve, something that had the quality of language. Not words I could understand. Not a human voice. But the rhythm of it, the variation in tone and duration, had the structure of communication. Something that had learned, over a very long time, how to produce sounds in patterns. I put the cover back on the well. I sat down on the concrete floor with my back against the shelf of notebooks, and I stayed there for a long time. I drove back to the city and spent 3 evenings reading notebooks. The estate lawyer had raised an eyebrow when I'd asked if I could borrow some of the property's documents for my survey work. I'd told him they were relevant to the property assessment, which was true enough. He'd said fine, sign them out, bring them back. I took 10 years' worth. 1974 through 1983, the beginning of the record. The woman's name was Elena Veith. She had bought the property in 1974 at the age of 32 and had lived there alone until her death at 81. She had been a retired school teacher, a reader, a gardener. She had kept a vegetable garden, had corresponded with a sister in Oregon, had driven into town on Thursdays for groceries and the library. This information assembled itself from incidental references in the notebooks, the texture of an ordinary life recorded at the edges of something extraordinary. The extraordinary thing was the well. She had heard the sound for the first time in August of 1974, 2 months after finding the room. She had described it in her characteristic careful way, not frightening, not welcoming. Simply present. As if the thing below was neither hostile nor indifferent, but was instead engaged in something she didn't have a framework to understand. Over the following months, she had developed a practice. Every Sunday, she came to the room. She sat beside the well. She listened, She recorded what she heard. By 1976, she had begun to distinguish patterns. The sound was not random. Certain sequences recurred. She began notating them in the margins of the notebooks, developing her own shorthand, lines of varying length and weight, representing the duration and intensity of each sound, arranged in the order she heard them. By 1978, she had filled an entire notebook with nothing but notation. She had spent 10 years, I realized, learning a language. And in the 1983 notebook, in an entry from April, she had written, "I believe it responded to me today. I have been making sound, speaking to it, though I know it cannot understand speech as such. Today, when I finished speaking, the sound changed. It produced a sequence I have not heard before. A new pattern. I do not know what it means. But something new has happened. I am recording this carefully." I put down the 1983 notebook and sat very still. Elena Veith had spent 9 years in dialogue with something at the bottom of that well. And she had done it alone. She had told no one. She had kept the door to the utility room unremarkable, the room itself unmapped on official documents. She had protected it, or protected herself, or both. I thought about the 49 notebooks on the shelf. I thought about a note in the 2023 notebook. I record this in case the record matters to whoever comes after. She had known or suspected that someone would eventually find the room. She had left the record for that person. I was that person. I went back on a Saturday. I brought a notebook of my own, a composition notebook, the same kind she'd used, bought at a drugstore the day before. I sat on the floor beside the well, and I lifted the cover and I listened. It took about 20 minutes before the sound began. Long enough that I wondered if it wouldn't come, if whatever was down there had somehow known that the familiar presence was gone and would not return. But it came. The low resonance, the felt frequency, the quality of presence that preceded the sound itself. I listened for 2 hours. I couldn't notate it the way Elena had. I didn't have her years of practice, her developed shorthand, her accumulated understanding of the patterns. But I wrote down what I could: duration, approximate register, the subjective quality of each sequence. Whether it felt like a statement or a question. Whether it felt like repetition or something new. At some point in the second hour, I spoke. I don't know what made me do it. The same thing that had made Elena do it, probably. The sense that something was present and listening, that the silence on my end of the exchange was itself a kind of communication. I said, "My name is Nina Voss. I found Elena's notebooks. I came because she left a record for whoever came after, and I am whoever came after." The sound stopped. Complete silence for maybe 10 seconds. Then something I had not heard in the 2 hours of listening. A single, clean tone. Not the usual low resonance. Higher, cleaner, brief. 4 seconds, and then gone. I wrote it down with a shaking hand. It had the quality, subjectively, of acknowledgement. The sound a person makes when they've understood something they weren't sure they'd understood. I know this is projection. I know I'm a surveyor who spent 2 hours sitting next to a well and is now attributing emotional content to acoustic phenomena that I have no framework to interpret. I know all of that. But I have spent 11 years measuring things, and I trust my instruments, and that sound felt like acknowledgement. I put the cover back on the well and sat on the floor for a long time. I finished the property survey and filed my report with the estate lawyer. I noted the room and the well in my survey documentation. They were part of the property. They had to be included. The lawyer was briefly puzzled by them and then moved on, the way estate lawyers do when they encounter something that doesn't affect the sale price. I asked him what was going to happen to the property. He said it had a buyer, a young couple from the city, looking for a rural property with acreage. They were closing in 6 weeks. I asked if Elena Veith had left any instructions about the room or its contents. He looked at me for a moment. He said she left instructions that the notebooks in the back room were to remain with the property. She was specific about that. She included it in the will. He showed me the relevant paragraph. The notebooks shall remain in the room in which they were kept and shall pass with the property to any future owner. They are a record and a responsibility. A record and a responsibility. I drove home and thought about those words for a long time. I thought about a 32-year-old woman buying a farmhouse in 1974 and discovering, 2 months later, that something lived at the bottom of a well in a room that shouldn't exist. I thought about her choosing, deliberately and thoughtfully, to stay, to listen, to record, to spend 49 years in patient, careful attention to something she couldn't explain and couldn't share and couldn't walk away from. I thought about the young couple from the city, closing in 6 weeks. I thought about what they would find when they moved the washer. I have been back to the property 4 times since the survey. The first time was before the sale closed. I knocked on the door of the estate lawyer's office and told him I'd left a piece of equipment at the property and needed to retrieve it. He gave me the key without looking up from his desk. I went to the room and I sat beside the well and I read Elena's notebooks for 3 hours. Not all of them. I didn't have time for all of them. I read the 1974 notebook through to the end, and then I read the last 5 years. 2019 through 2023. By 2019, her notation had become extraordinarily dense. She had developed a system of symbols that encoded not just the acoustic properties of what she heard, but her interpretations, her hypotheses, her evolving understanding of what the patterns meant. The notebooks from her final years read less like a log and more like a correspondence, like one side of a conversation that had been going on for 45 years and had reached a depth and complexity that she couldn't easily summarize for a newcomer. But she had tried. In the first pages of the 2023 notebook, before the dated weekly entries began, she had written a long, undated passage that I read 3 times. She wrote, "I am 79 years old, and I am aware that I will not always be here. I have been trying for several years to write a summary of what I have learned, but I find that the learning is not separable from the time it took. 45 years of listening is not a thing that can be compressed into pages. What I can say is this: it is not dangerous. I believe this with the confidence that comes from long experience. It is not hostile. It is not indifferent. It is something that has existed in that place for a very long time, longer than the house, longer than human memory of this land, and it is curious in the way that very old things are sometimes curious. Slowly, carefully, with the patience of something that is not in a hurry, because it has learned that patience is the only language that matters. I have spoken to it every week for 45 years. I do not know if it understands me. I know that it has changed in that time, and I believe, though I cannot prove, that some of the change is a response to me. That I am part of its record, the way it is part of mine. Whoever finds these notebooks, you are not obligated. You can close the door and walk away and sell the property and never think about this again. Many people would. I might have in 1974 if I had been a different person. But if you stay, if you choose to sit beside the well and listen, you are entering into something that will take time. It will ask nothing of you that you are not willing to give. But it will ask for time. That is the only thing it has ever asked of me. I sat on the concrete floor and read that passage a 3rd time. Then I took out my own notebook and wrote, "I will come back." The property sold in September. The young couple moved in. I know this because I drove past on a Sunday in October and saw lights in the windows and a car in the drive that hadn't been there before. I don't know if they've found the room yet. I don't know what they'll do when they do. I have no claim on that property. I am a surveyor who was hired to do a job and did it. I have no reason to go back, and yet. Elena Veith spent 49 years keeping a record. She kept it not for herself. She knew what she knew. She didn't need to write it down for her own sake. She kept it for whoever came after. She kept it because she believed the record mattered, and she believed that whoever found it would be the right person to find it, and she left them the choice. She left me the choice. I am a surveyor. I measure things. I produce accurate accounts of what exists. I have spent 11 years doing this work, and I am good at it, and it has never before required me to decide whether a thing I found in the course of a job was also, in some way, a responsibility. I have been thinking about the single, clean tone. The 4 seconds of something that felt like acknowledgement. I have been thinking about it, the way you think about a thing you did not expect to think about. I have been thinking about Sunday mornings. I have been thinking about notebooks. I don't know yet what I'm going to do. I don't know if I'll go back. I don't know if the new owners will find the room and call a contractor to fill in the well and throw the notebooks in a dumpster. And if that happens, I don't know what it means for whatever is at the bottom of that dark water. What I know is that for 49 years, every Sunday without exception, a woman drove to a room with no windows and sat beside a well in the dark and listened. And whatever she heard kept her coming back for the rest of her life. I think about that. I think about it more than I expected to. I think about it on Sunday mornings, especially. Most people don't think about the history of the buildings they live in. They think about the rent, the commute, the closet space. Maybe they notice if the floors are original hardwood or if the windows rattle in winter. But the history, who was there before them, what happened in those rooms, that's not something most people spend any time with. It's background. It doesn't affect the square footage. I've been a property manager for 18 years. I want to be precise about what that means, because people hear property manager and picture someone collecting checks and calling the plumber, and that's not wrong exactly, but it's not the whole picture either. What I actually do, especially in the kind of properties I've spent most of my career managing, which are old buildings, buildings with 50 or 60 or 70 years of tenancy behind them, is closer to institutional memory. I know who lived where. I know which units have been renovated and which haven't been touched since the original build. I know which leases are clean and which ones have histories. A building is a document if you know how to read it, and I've spent 18 years learning how to read buildings. I'm telling you this because what happened in a building I thought I understood completely. I had managed it for 11 years before the events I'm going to describe. I knew every unit, every tenant, every structural quirk. Or I thought I did. The building was a 6-story residential built in 1951, brick, solid, the kind of post-war construction that was built to last and has lasted. 42 units. It had been in the same family's ownership for most of its existence, which is unusual and which, in my experience, tends to mean good maintenance records. The family that owned it, I'll call them the Alderts, which isn't their name, had managed it themselves until the early 90s, when the last of the original generation died and the heirs, scattered across 3 states and uniformly uninterested in becoming landlords, hired a management company. That was us. That was how I inherited the building. When I took over, The oldest tenant in the building had been there since 1974. Her name was Mrs. Paulette Schreier. She was in her late 70s. She lived in Unit 4B on the 4th floor, and she had, according to the outgoing manager who briefed me, a month-to-month lease that had rolled over from an original term lease signed in 1974, at a rent that had been increased roughly in line with inflation over the decades, but was still well below market. Legally protected, morally untouchable. She was, as the outgoing manager put it, part of the building. I met Mrs. Schreier on my first walkthrough. She was a small woman, precise in her movements and her speech, the kind of person who had clearly been meticulous her entire life and had only gotten more so with age. Her apartment was immaculate. She offered me coffee and I accepted, and we sat at her kitchen table and talked for about 20 minutes, and in that time she told me the names of every tenant on the 4th floor, when they'd moved in, and one specific piece of information about each of them. Not gossip, exactly, more like a caseworker's notation. He's quiet, but he plays guitar at odd hours. She has family visiting most weekends. These two have a cat they're not supposed to have. The Alderts always knew and never said anything. She knew the building the way I knew buildings. Which is to say, she knew it the way you know something you've lived inside for a very long time. I managed the building for 11 years with Mrs. Schreier in 4B. In that time, she required very little from me. One repair to her kitchen faucet in 2009. One call about a neighbor's noise in 2013 that turned out to be a misunderstanding. She paid rent on the 1st of every month by check, with a brief handwritten note that varied slightly each month, but always said some version of the same thing. Thank you, everything is fine, see you next month. I genuinely liked her. I think she genuinely liked me. We had a relationship that was, in the context of landlord-tenant dynamics, unusually warm. She died in March of the 16th year of my management. She was 83. The cause was a stroke, quick in her sleep, as good a death as anyone could hope for. I found out from her daughter, who called me 2 days after it happened to discuss the unit. The unit sat empty for 4 months while the estate was settled, and the daughter arranged for the contents to be removed. During that time, I did a preliminary walkthrough to assess condition, which is standard, and I noted a few things that would need attention before releasing. The kitchen appliances were original to a 1970s renovation. The bathroom tile needed regrouting. The carpets in the bedroom were overdue for replacement. Standard 4-month vacancy maintenance. I budgeted it, scheduled it, moved on. The work crews went in July. Carpet crew on a Tuesday, tile crew on a Wednesday, appliance delivery on Friday. The carpet crew was in and out in 3 hours. No issues. The tile crew called me at 11:15 on Wednesday morning. The man who called, his name was Darius, I had used his company for years, was not easily rattled. I want to emphasize that. He had been doing tile work in residential buildings for more than 20 years, and he was, in my experience, a practical, unflappable person. He said, "Dennis, there's something you should see in 4B. I said, "What kind of something?" He said, "I'm not sure how to describe it. Can you come?" The bathroom in Unit 4B was standard for a 50s building. Small, black and white penny tile on the floor, white subway tile on the walls, a tub shower combination, a pedestal sink. The grout had failed along the back wall of the shower. That was what needed regrouting. And Darius's crew had started by removing the damaged grout and the several tiles adjacent to it that had started to shift. Behind the tiles on the back wall of the shower, between the tile and the substrate, there was a space. It shouldn't have been there. Properly installed tile sits flush against its substrate with a thin, even layer of adhesive and nothing else. the space behind the back wall of Mrs. Schreier's shower was about 1.5 inches deep, running from approximately knee height to shoulder height, roughly 3 feet wide. In that space, arranged with some care, were photographs. Not 1 or 2 photographs. Dozens of them. Old photographs, black and white, the kind with the deckled white borders that you see in pictures from the 40s and 50s. They were arranged in an overlapping pattern along the back of the substrate wall, attached with what looked like dried paste. The kind of paste, Darius told me, that he associated with old wallpaper adhesive. They had been there a long time. The paper had yellowed, and in some places had begun to adhere to the back of the tile itself. Some of them had degraded to the point of illegibility. But many of them were still clear. They were photographs of a child. The same child in all of them, as far as I could tell. A girl based on the clothing, dresses, hair ribbons, the fashions of the 40s. She looked to be somewhere between 5 and 10 years old in the earliest photographs, and older, perhaps 12 or 13, in the later ones. The photographs appeared to span several years. There were perhaps 60 or 70 of them visible. I stood in that bathroom for a long time. Darius stood beside me, and after a while he said, very quietly, "Should I keep going?" I said, "Not yet. I want to describe what I did next, because I've thought about it a lot since, and I think the sequence of decisions I made in the next 2 weeks tells you something about how a person responds when they encounter something they can't immediately categorize. My first instinct was practical. Photograph everything before anything was disturbed, which Darius had already done. His photographs went into a folder on his phone, then to mine. The arrangement behind the wall was documented. My second instinct was to find out who had installed the original tile. I went to the Aldert family archive, which I had access to as part of the management contract, and which was extensive. The family had kept records going back to the building's construction. I was looking for renovation records from the early 1950s that might tell me when the bathroom had been tiled and by whom. What I found instead was a gap. The Aldert records showed consistent documentation of the building from 1951 forward. Leases, maintenance logs, insurance records. But the period from early 1953 to late 1954, roughly 18 months, was almost entirely absent from the records. No maintenance logs, no lease renewals, nothing. Just a gap, and then the records resumed in late 1954 as if nothing had happened. I noted this and kept looking. The original tenant records for the building, going back to its opening in 1951, were in the archive. They were handwritten in a ledger that the original building superintendent had maintained. I went through the ledger, looking for Unit 4B. Unit 4B had been first tenanted in November 1951. A couple, surnamed Veith, husband and wife. The ledger noted, in April 1953, a single line, Veith E. Departed. And then, in the same handwriting, but seemingly written at a slightly different time, a notation I had to read twice to be sure I'd read correctly. Unit sealed per owner instruction. July 1953. And then, in November 1954, unit reopened. New tenant, Schreier P. Paulette Schreier, who had lived in that unit continuously for 61 years until she died. I'm going to tell you what I was able to piece together, and I want to be clear about what I know for certain and what I've inferred, because I think the distinction matters. What I know, a couple named Veith lived in Unit 4B from 1951 until April 1953, at which point someone identified as Veith E. departed, just one of them, not both. The unit was then sealed by the owner for reasons not recorded for approximately 16 months. It was reopened in November 1954 and leased to Paulette Schreier, who lived in it until her death in the 16th year of my management. What I was able to find out with additional research: a woman named Elena Veith had lived at the building's address according to city directory records from 1951 and 1952. She did not appear in the 1953 directory or any subsequent directory at any address. A man named Robert Veith appeared in the 1954 directory at a different address across town. What I found in the county records: a death certificate filed in May 1953 for a female minor, age 9, surname Veith, first name Margaret. Cause of death listed as pneumonia. Address at time of death, the building. A child named Margaret Veith had died in Unit 4B in May 1953. The photographs behind the tile were almost certainly photographs of Margaret Veith. Someone, and I believe it was her mother, Elena, who departed the building shortly after the death, had put them there. What I don't know, and what I've never been able to determine with any certainty, is whether Paulette Schreier knew about the photographs. She lived in that apartment for 61 years. The bathroom tile, based on what Darius could tell me from the adhesive and the substrate, had been installed before she moved in. Almost certainly during the 16 months the unit was sealed after the Veiths left. The photographs were behind the tile when Mrs. Schreier moved in, and they were still there when she died. She could have discovered them and decided to leave them. She could have never known. I have no way to determine which. But here is what I keep coming back to. She lived alone in that apartment for the last 30 years of her life after her husband died. She kept the apartment immaculate. She was meticulous. She knew that building the way I knew buildings. And she called me every month for 16 years with a note that said some version of, "Everything is fine, see you next month." I made a decision about the photographs. I've thought about it many times since, and I think it was the right decision, though I'm not entirely certain. I didn't remove them. The tile crew regrouted the shower without disturbing the back wall. The photographs stayed where they had been for 71 years. They are, as far as I know, still there now. Behind the tile, in the space that shouldn't exist, in the apartment that is currently occupied by a young couple who moved in 3 months after the work was completed, and who have given me no reason to think anything is wrong. Before I closed the wall back up, I did one thing. I went to the archive, and I found a photograph of Mrs. Schreier. There was one, from a building event the Aldert family had organized in the 80s, a photograph of tenants at some kind of gathering. Paulette Schreier was in it, younger, smiling. I had it printed, and I put it behind the tile with the others. I'm not a sentimental person, as a rule. I don't think I was making a statement. I think I just felt, standing in that bathroom, that if someone had loved that child enough to seal her memory into the walls of the place where she died, and if another person had lived inside those walls for 61 years, whether she knew it or not, then those two people belonged together in some way I didn't have a word for. So I put them together. The building is still under my management. The young couple in 4B renewed their lease last spring. They seem happy there. I check in on the building more than I strictly need to. That's not unusual for me. I have a proprietary feeling about properties I've managed for a long time, a sense of ongoing responsibility that doesn't fully turn off. But I check in on this one a little more. The current tenants on the 4th floor tell me occasionally that the building is quiet, that they sleep well, that it feels like a place where people have been comfortable for a long time. I think that's probably true. I think about Mrs. Schreier sometimes, her monthly notes, her meticulous records, her 20 minutes of coffee and caseworker precise observations on her first day meeting me. I think about what it would mean to live in a place for 61 years. To know it the way she knew it. Every sound, every neighbor, every creak in the floor. And I think about the possibility, I can't confirm it, I'll never be able to confirm it, that she knew. That somewhere in those 61 years, she found the space behind the tile and saw the photographs and understood what she was living inside of. And that she decided, the way I decided, to leave it alone. That it wasn't hers to disturb. That some things that have been kept for a long time should stay kept. I don't know if that's what happened. I know what the records show, and the records end before they can tell me the rest. But every month, when I log the rent payment from Unit 4B, automated now, no paper checks, no handwritten notes, I think about her. About all the months she sat down at that kitchen table and wrote those small, careful notes. Everything is fine.